Hello and welcome to Bharata First. I'm Frank Rausan Pereira. This is Frank Talk, and I have a very special guest with me on the program today. He wears several hats, two of them being, of course, he is one of the leading insolvency lawyers in the country and an author of several books. It's a pleasure to welcome on the program Sumant Batra.
Thank you so much, Frank. Thank you for having me at your show.
And today we'll talk about your latest book, Kafila.
Look forward to that.
It's a wonderful book. You gave me a small little anecdote, before the recording started about what it is all about. And I must say that it is incredible. It is lovely. Can't wait to read the book just by hearing, the little bit of anecdote that you gave me is wonderful. And I think your family has gone through a lot.
Thank you.
And
I hope you enjoy reading it. It's a bit of emotive, but yes,
it is highly emotive, gratitude really. Let's dive straight into it. Why don't you tell us about the background and what led you to write this book and why you thought that you need to put this story out there?
So there are three reasons that I can think of, although I hadn't really done a structured thinking of how and why I should do this book. The immediate prompt were the events in Bangladesh in August, when suddenly the toppling of the government happened and an anti-India narrative started. Despite the fact that in 1971 it is India that had helped the creation of Bangladesh. I started deep diving and wondering why and how. And I think one thing other led to my going back into the memory lane and remembering all the stories, anecdotes, which my grandfather, grandmother, some of the other relatives, elders in the family, my father, my uncle, my father's elder brother, they used to tell us about the times when they came from what is now in Pakistan. I've always been a student of history, so therefore it fascinated me in which ways. And I thought that perhaps one might want to connect the dots, and I started diving a little deeper. And the third thing that actually was really the reason that made me decide that I must write a book on this is because I thought that my children, and I'm sure the entire generation of the age that my children belong to, which is, they're all in their late teens or early teens. They have absolutely no idea of this part of the history of the country, or the subcontinent, except for that, what they might just have read in the newspapers or on the news. I'm sure many of them don't even remember the name of their great-grandfathers who came there. I wouldn't have had my father not written down in his diary all his great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, their age, when they died and everything a little bit. And I thought I must do this service to the entire generation by recording, but not just then the story of my family, but the times in which all these events took place, the partition, the migration.
It's so important because, it just rang a bell for me as well when we were speaking about it. I actually don't know the names of my great-grandfathers or great-grandmothers, I never really thought about asking my parents also, their names or what they did or what it is or what their background is. So I think this is incredible.
Yeah, and although I'm thankful to my father that he did document the name of his forefathers, but not foremothers, as you might call them. Nobody knew the name of the sisters. Because it was a patriarchal society, so what really mattered was, where your lineage as your father, grandfather. And that's where the struggle happened, how do I find that? And that's why, we have only one partition survivor in our family, 94-year-old, and he remembers. He remembered every name of his sister, who he was married to, where she was married to, where she lived, and how they came. And that's how I was able to connect the dots. But I think for me, one of the important things was that you had to, it depends on what times era you write about this. If things would have been written immediately after partition or migration, you would have written more about bitterness, something which was heavily under the weight of your emotions, perhaps even sometimes lacking the objectivity. Right? Written a few decades down the line, people would see it differently. Also, of course, it'll depend on what your loss has been, or whether you have observed yourself, whether you're a partition victim, or whether you're just a student of history, or this side of the history or that side of the history. And we all know narratives have been built from here and there. And I thought I should write it as a second generation partition, let's say survivor, family. And how do I say this? What is my prism? And I then did it purely as a research as far as the times are concerned. And therefore, you'll see my book, when you read it, you'll find, Frank, that there are two stories that run in parallel. One is the documentation of the history of partition, because it's important for people to know the context, the backdrop in which all this was happening. Starting with the demand of partition, the Lahore Resolution, and then, of course, how it started affecting the lives of the people, the ordinary people who had nothing to do with it, who had faith in their politicians, but their politicians were then doing a different thing altogether. And how living in villages hundreds of miles away from Delhi, thousands of miles at times, or even, many thousand miles away from London, because everything was decided in London and Delhi. And yet they were the ones who were uprooted. Yet they were the ones who suddenly, as a whole generation, lost everything that they had, including their identity. But for us, to stay objective, write it with a great amount of composure, despite the fact that it is highly emotional, was not an easy task. But I think it did help in a way that, when you're a lawyer, your mind is trained to rationalize things and not just go with one narrative that you might just have read and just suddenly believe that's truth. And then you read the other narrative and say, this, and then you start analyzing and you put what you believe is your truth.
So, the story of partition, like you mentioned, rightly mentioned as well, even if you look at it from history's perspective, hardly do we study it in our schools as well. It's such a big part of Indian history, but, growing up, at least, I don't remember it being in our history books. I'm not sure whether it's come into the history curriculum now, but if it hasn't, it surely has to, because you can't change history at the end of the day, and it is part of our history. And I think it's wonderful that, that a person from the second generation is actually taking the effort to document all of this and to bring it out into the public domain, so that the generations, the third generation that you're talking about, have a clear idea as to what their identity is. Yes, you mentioned about how identities were lost, but that is also part of identity at the end of the day today. So it's wonderful to bring those stories to the fore. Talking about stories
Can
to
I
the
just
fore.
make one
please.
comment, Frank, just to sort of supplement what you just mentioned. Well, in history books, a lot has been written to justify the partition, to justify why one had to agree to those divisions at that point of time, for whatever reasons. I don't want to go into the merits of that, because I'm not a historian in that sense. I'm not a political opinion maker. So I just recorded facts. But what is very unfortunate is that the migration, which is the most brutal and the largest migration in the history of this earth, of these times, or ever, is just mentioned in the footprints, in the footnotes.
Yeah.
And that's a tragedy. How could you just not let people know, that millions of people lost their lives and were affected? And I think that there the history has been unfair. And foreign authors have written more about that than our historians. Not that they haven't, but maybe they had their own reasons. But I do hope that my book would be of some use to this generation and the next.
Talking about stories, why don't you tell us the story of your great-grandfather and your great-grandmother, and what they actually went through during these turbulent and difficult times, because they were living that. And the good thing is it has been passed on, to you and hopefully to the next generation as well, so that you just know what happened.
So till the middle of July 1947, everybody thought that they could be at best a partition, but they still thought or hoped against hope that it won't really happen. And everybody thought that maybe our village would not be included in the partition. It will still remain where it is. And therefore, there was never really any major concern. And I think they were too innocent to even imagine anything beyond that. The villages that they lived in, my ancestor lived in a village called Rodu Sultan in Jhangi. And Jhangi was a village known for communal harmony. It was the land of Sufism, even today. And as it was then, it was a hub of Sufi shrines.
Before we move ahead,
Yeah.
just very quickly, from a geographical point of view, so that we understand, where
Yeah.
Jhangi really is. If you could
Yeah.
just point it out exactly, from in terms of a
Yeah.
big city in Pakistan.
Yeah,
that we-
so in Pakistan, Multan is a very big division,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And one of the parts of Multan was Jhang, and Jhang was the area through which the village Chenab passed.
Hmm.
And the areas that fell on both sides of Chenab were very fertile.
Yes.
But the history of Jhang is that while a lot of it was Sal land is basically rocky land, which was not cultivable, it was not fertile. When during the British Raj, because they had to feed such large army, and also their animals, the horses and the camels, they needed more and more fertile land where they could actually produce fodder for them, and also rice or whatever for their army personnel. So they decided to bring canal to the Sal area, some of the Sal areas, using Chenab River. And my family at that point of time, which lived closer to the Chenab, which was already fertile, then moved in the inner areas of Sa, where the Sal land was, so that they could cultivate that land and make it more and more fertile. And this was also, Multan was the hub where the trading hub, all the spices, the other things from south came to north, and from there it went to Multan. From Multan they went to Middle East and further beyond. And therefore it was a very rich trading hub. And Jhang was on the way to the Far East. And therefore, that's where people used to wait, sing, relax, and because it was something which was, in my view, as I've read and as even the British had chronicled in the British Gazette, that this is where there was no fight, no war, no threat from ruffians. Caravans used to relax. They were singing Sufism, and that was the ecosystem of Jhang. And my grandparents lived there, and their ancestors as well. They owned large pieces of land. Substantial pieces were owned by Muslim Qurayshis, who also had maybe they ruled over Jhang a long time back. But of course, when the Ranjit Singh, he took over Kashmir and this part, he was ruling it. And from that time, it was Punjab. It was ruled by the Sikhs. And after that, of course, the British took over. That was their world, their village, their lands, their animals, their own people. They had a school in the village, they had a temple, there was a mosque in the village. That was the world. And they were not just willing to accept that this could be disrupted. But then sometime in the middle of July, when Lahore, they were just broke into violence, there was fire all over and spread soon to the rural villages approaching Jhang. They decided that they'll probably have to save their lives, go back to where my grandmother belonged, which was now a village called Kalanor near Rohtak in Haryana, for a couple of months. And then once things settle down, they'll go back. And that's how they were planning. But things started going a little bad, and then they decided to fortify the village because there were attacks that were starting to happen, stray attacks. And then, one fine day, one of their family friends, a Muslim, he was a block development officer. He arrived in the village and he said that it's no longer safe to live in the village because there are people from the adjoining villages who've gotten together and they're going to attack the village tonight. And you have to leave. If you don't leave, then it'll be too late. And then suddenly, whatever they could carry, the clothes, my grandmother carried two small idols, one of Rama, one of Krishna. Jewelry they left and buried, but she stole something, although everybody's saying don't carry jewelry because that's inviting trouble. but she did keep something hidden, a little bit of pieces. One fistful of soil, and that too from the room from where the temple was, the house temple was. And they left for Toba Tek Singh, where that video, the Muslim friend, he offered that their sister, they could take shelter there for a few days. And there was an influential family because they used to supply horses to the army and police forces. So they had influence. They also had weapons, so they could defend themselves. And they stayed there for till about 23rd August. But by 14th, 15th August, they could see that things were getting worse, despite the fact that Jinnah had on 14th August said, I want a secular Pakistan, everybody should stay there, nobody needs to feel threatened and lose. But he spoke in English, and nobody understood English in rural parts of Punjab, West Punjab. And people thought this Pakistan Islamic State drive out everybody who's a kafir, a non-believer. And suddenly people were being pushed out of the village, forced to convert, or they were going to be killed. And when it was getting out of the hand, this BDO friend arrived back again, and he told them that now it is not safe to even live here anymore. Any day villagers would attack because they're seeing us now as traitors, giving shelter to Hindus. And while we are ready to fight and give up our lives for you, but we all need to decide whether that's a better thing to do, or try and leave and hope that you will reach India, Hindustan. And then they were to leave. They had to leave. And 3 weeks, nearly 3 weeks as a Kafila, the title of the book, without food, without water, see their children die, see people die of sickness, of hunger, share whatever food you had, but you had limited. Abundant villages, water ponds, wells contaminated, dead bodies thrown in, dead animals thrown in, so that people couldn't use that water. Crops, standing crops were burnt. You could see bodies, dead bodies lying. And then, of course, they were attacked on the way as well. That I've also mentioned in the book. And at some point in time, I think the governments on both sides decided that we need to structure this partition and help rather than let people be on their own. Because till such that time, they were all trying to resist official level, the migration, completely distant from the reality. Especially as I understand from history, Gandhiji was very upset that why this partition is happening. He was still hoping that people will go back. But I think it appeared very obvious that that was not going to happen. And government, military stepped in. And the tail end of their Kafila towards the border, about 200 kilometers before, the military truck arrived, escorted them. The most difficult part was when you saw the Hindus, a karma of 5 to 6 kilometers, thousands and thousands going to India, and 100 yards away you could see another one coming from India, all Muslims, and they're all abusing one another, shouting, instigating, provoking. Very emotional because they've lost their lives, they were losing everything on the way and had left behind everything. And of course, at some places there was confrontation, people lost life. But in some places, people intervened, the army had to intervene. Finally, they reached Lahore, where a transit camp had been set up, and rested there for 2-3 days before crossing Wagah border, where obviously a different life started altogether. It was a big relief. It was a relief that they had reached something which is now Hindustan, but of course, it was also a relief of they were able to celebrate freedom for the first time, independence.
But it brought about its own set of challenges, because you're coming to a new place, completely uprooted from what you knew life was all about, because that's the only way they knew how to live. Suddenly, you're taken out of that and put into a new place, and starting all afresh and all anew without anything in
I
hand.
think the most complex, or I think troublesome thing was that, Frank, they had no time to mourn their death
Mm.
because my great grandfather died 2 days before they left the village. My great grandmother died on the way. They lost a few relatives on the way. They saw so much of brutality, bloodshed. It's not the loss of the property, but the loss of identity, everything. They didn't even have the time to mourn for it because they were all, every day was a struggle to survive, help others. So when they reached the cross border, I think that relief was largely because they were now able to mourn. They were able to remember the dead, offer prayers. They had not been able to give them a decent burial, right? So I think that's when the relief set in, but also the real, in my view, the it struck them what had occurred to them and what had happened. And then, of course, having to rebuild their life and rehabilitate is a different story altogether. That's another chapter that started soon after they arrived. And I mean, I think one of the things which my father used to tell me was that, he remembered that his elder brother, 4 years elder, when their grains were, obviously they were short of grains and everything, he would say, "I'm not hungry, give it to Gobind, my father," because, younger to him. He wouldn't understand that. And how my grandmother used to cry that, the elder boy is going hungry so that the younger can. And, but the resilience that came in the entire community of Punjabi Khatris who rebuilt their lives came out of all that they're seen. It was having lost everything and having to rebuild. They saw so much that it also gave them the strength, the resilience to rebuild their lives. And I think I salute them not just for that, but also for the fact that they never carried any bitterness for the Muslims or for any community. I don't think, I mean, they did mourn their dead or the loss of their property because farmers are very attached to their land, the soil, right? So that loss was not just because of the material loss, it was the loss of their identity to where they belong, the place, the smell of the air, the birds, the water, the sound of the water, the ponds in which they swam, the dhanis, the village, the small house, a room where they had the tubal or whatever in the village, in the fields where they steal a drink at night and sleep there because otherwise in their house you're not allowed to drink, but the young would. And I know that R.S. Majis didn't eat meat, but my grandfather was a very good friend of this Qureshi family, and that they cooked very good meat, and my grandfather liked it. But they would then go in the village at night. They will cook quietly and sleep there only. I mean, I think it's all that put together is that they really saw as a tragedy. And then they could only rebuild their lives because they did not carry any bitterness. Had they carried any bitterness, the biases, their narrative of their life would have been very different.
I think that's a great message for the rest of the world as well. If you look at what's happening around the world today, there's so much to take away from this.
True.
So much to take away. So, what were some of the rehabilitation challenges? You're speaking about rehabilitation. Clearly, there would have been some challenges along the way.
Yeah, I think for them, soon after they crossed the Wagah border, they were told that you'll have to surrender your bullock, oxen, everything, because from here you'll have to now go on the train because things are very bad on the way. There was still a lot of tension. So I remember that my grandmother told me that she actually hugged the oxen, because it's a member of the family. And to let it go, they had to stay in Kurukshetra camp for about a few days. Kurukshetra camp was flooded with people. It was like a city. And it obviously continued for a very long time because You had to set up a school, hospitals, everything. But my family, I mean, they came from a very illustrious thing. They were very uncomfortable, especially because the women had to bathe in open. There were no toilets, bathrooms like that, right? Covered. Well, they used to live in big houses and had privacy in these moments. So it was tragic for them. They couldn't stay there for 3-4 days, and they were dying to get back to their Kalanor village. After a few days, they sold 1 or 2 Bengals that she had brought to buy another bullock cart, and left for Rohtak. Crossed into Karnal, and Karnal is where they stayed in camp for 2 days. Their family members came from Kalanor, took them, and there again another mourning happened because my grandfather's one sister was married there, and she could not come to the death of her father, who died a few days before they left. So, and they had to mourn again. So there was whole women getting together, the family, for the first time. After that was done, then they were sent to not really rehabilitation, but in a village near Nilokhedi, present Karnal in Haryana, where the entire village belonging to Muslims had been abandoned. So these people who had come from Rodu Sultan and some of the nearing villages and their relatives, they stayed in that village in the houses of people who had left, Muslims. And I have to admit, because I've been told that it was a difficult decision for them, because they were friendly with the Muslims, but to stay in the houses of Muslims was a bit difficult, for them, especially to eat out of those houses, because that was the only thing. And in those times, it was a bit different, Frank. But then this process of rehabilitation started. The government of India came out with an ordinance to rehabilitate those people who had come from Pakistan. Then it was in Pakistan. And there was a formula that depending on the size of the land and where it was, how fertile it was, would you get allotted land here? If you had fertile land, you'll get fertile land here. But you would get a lesser number because here the land was more fertile. But there were formulas. But the difficulty was that not many Muslims had large tracts of land here who had left. So the availability of the land was little. And my family was very insecure. They wanted to stay together, which meant they needed a few hundred bighas, which were not available as one single patch of land. At least in Rohtak, that's where most of the Jhangis were allotted land, and even today are staying. They were then said, why did you go to Terai? But they didn't want to go to Uttar Pradesh because the culture was different. They wanted to stay in Punjab, even though they had come to this part, but the culture was slightly similar. So they ultimately opted for Hisar. And please remember, this was all Punjab.
Punjab, yes.
So, but Hisar was nothing but sand dunes. It was known as Kalapani of Punjab. It was punishment posting for government officers, because otherwise it was Himachal or Amritsar, Ludhiana, Jalandhar, Chandigarh. Chandigarh was a bit later, but Patiala, all that, Pepsu, or maybe very close to Delhi. But everything else, Rewari, Mewat, Hisar, that belt near Rajasthan, because we are close to the Rajasthan border, was all sand dunes. And I remember when I was born there in 65, the canal had just come, Indira Gandhi Canal. But for 20 years, it was just barren land. They would just, during the monsoon, grow something. But after that, nothing. And if monsoon was not good, you're left to nothing. The wells were not successful. The water would turn red. And all this is documented in the Gazette. Not that I've been told as much, but it's all history, documented with the British. And so they sold small pieces. But the biggest problem for them was that, again, the whole village, it was then called as Kuradi, and now it's called as Arenagar, because we were RS Samajis, so it was named as Arenagar. But it was Kuradi, and it was owned by a landlord called Ismail Khan, a feudal landlord. quite authoritative, and he would not allow anybody else to build a pakka house. So his haveli was the only, concrete house. He would not even allow people to build their huts next to one another because they didn't want people to start conspiring against him and mobilize. So you have to have scattered. No temple was allowed. There was only one village, a well and that was in his house premises. Only if you were sick or otherwise you were allowed to take water. Otherwise you had to fetch water from far away, different places. And that was his way to control people. He left for Pakistan with his women. He had 4 or 5 wives and his children, but he couldn't take everything else. So obviously the villagers in revenge took over his house, his land, whatever he had left behind. And that was the land and house that was allotted to us. It was got vacated by the government with support of army, and it was given to us. And this is something my grandmother, used to tell when they came and they saw the kitchen was very different from how the Hindus had their kitchen. And so she actually, the godown where they used to store the grains when you used to come, she actually cleaned it, redid it, and purified it. And that's where she set up the kitchen till they built a new kitchen. She remembers. She used to tell me that. For 20 years, they struggled till the Indira Gandhi Canal came. Slowly sold their pieces of land because there was no other way of survival. At some point in time, they built a temple in the village because my grandmother felt that how do I survive without a temple? And then the canal came, lives changed. Land turned fertile, but with that came also the partition. Haryana was carved out of Pakistan. It was just Punjabi Suba demand. Nobody wanted Haryana. But the whole demand was of Punjabi Suba by Sikh leaders. They wanted Punjabi speaking. The whole politics around it. I've talked about that also in my book. The result was Haryana. And suddenly, my grandfather, my parents, everybody were now left in minority again. Because they were part of Punjab and now suddenly they are part of Haryana where the Punjabis are in minority. But fortunately, they never felt discriminated. Never felt any discriminated by the government, by the establishment. But the fact remains that we all know that Haryana is all about Jat, non-Jat. I mean, that's well known politically.
Yes.
But at the state level, once you're into the government, yes, I mean, you have to navigate your way through these things. But there was no state discrimination as such. So not as patent. I mean, we all know that even today, if you have a Jat chief minister, this is how things are going to pan out. If it's a non-Jat chief minister, it might pan out differently. We have seen that, and it's a bitter truth. But the fact remains that there is no real, discrimination in law, right? Which means that you can fight for your laws if somebody is doing which is illegal. And my father had to fight with one of the chief ministers. I mentioned about that episode in my life. Although this book is not my father's generation story, it's my grandfather. But my father was bothered by a chief minister, a very powerful chief minister. I haven't really named him. But what I'm trying to say is that they had to, at the social level, you were being referred as refugees. I think that is something which my grandfather was not able to reconcile with. He went into a shell, not because of the loss. Obviously, he had lost his parents, everything. That was a very deep tragedy. And I'm sure it affected him psychologically. He had no interest, material interest. He donated a lot. Once Swami Devananji, walked into his house, wanted to build a Gurukul on the land, our land. He said, I love that spot. It took them 30 seconds to take a decision. It's documented on the website of the Gurukul. And they donated 2 acres. They gathered cash to build it. And they continued to support it. My father supported it as well. Gave away everything. I'm not going to talk about their generosity, but coming back to the fact that his deep hurt was that they were refugees. They had become refugees perceivably in their own land. They could never really imagine how would you become a refugee in your land, because Jhangi was part of India.
Right.
And they just moved from Jhangi to Hisar. How could you possibly be caught as a refugee? That hurt, I think, was too deep. My father also faced that, but I think because of the fact that he saw so much growth, opportunities. And that's, I think, the greatness of India as a nation. That you may have so many narratives going on, but the fact remains, everybody has opportunities. You have a prime minister today who comes from an OBC, who has risen from where we all know. My father went on to hold constitutional office. And that's the might of India. That's the greatness of India. But at the social levels, we have tensions, which leaves scar also. We've handled that scar because we come from a very different historical background. Our resilience, our strength are different. But I'm not too sure the next generation would be able to handle it. They're not cut up that. They have a universalism around that. Their education comes from the same sources, whether it's the Instagram or whatever. They think very differently. Whether we hope that they will be able to iron these creases or whatever, we will still have to see. But I do hope that at least this generation will provide a closure to this dark chapter of our history on the subcontinent, where an entire generation comprising of millions of people, children, old, men, women, suffered. And the scar of that, or the wound of that, bleeds even today in one form or the other, needs to be healed. And that can only be healed by peace.
Absolutely.
If Bangladesh keeps happening and it keeps reminding you that what happened in partition or 97 was bad, then you are peeling the layers of the history to only bring those narratives out, which will keep the fire burning.
Let's look at it another way, right? Yes, closure is very important. Yes, healing is also very important. And I think that should be the fulcrum or the core of any issue. But at some level, don't you also think that everyone needs to know? Because that helps you understand who you are, the resilience that you're speaking about, and everything else. If you look at the Jews, they look at their genocide, they look at the Holocaust, and they have made that an integral part of them, because it's a reminder for them time and again to tell them how much of resilience they've shown and how much they've grown. And what is it that has taken them to be what they are today? I'm just throwing it out there.
You're absolutely right. And that's what I also say in my book. So when I say closure, I have said so. If you'll see the last paragraph of my preface, and if I can read it.
Yes, absolutely.
I'll just show to you that you have to provide closure not by ignorance, but by knowing the reality. It says, this Generation Z and Alpha from the subcontinent should educate themselves about the historical events that inflicted this painful wound and the resultant legacy of distress, so that they may attempt closure with full knowledge and awareness rather than ignorance. So
yes,
you're absolutely right. And I've given the example of Jews as well. And I'm so glad that Kishore and late Meghnath, they set up this partition museum in Amritsar. And incidentally, when you enter the museum, the first thing that you see is a map of Amritsar from pre-1947. And you will see below that, contributed by Sumant Batra. You'll see some other assets that have been contributed by us in that museum. In fact, after the launch of the book, we're going to the Partition Museum. And there's, of course, a small one here as well. But I hope there are a number of such partition museums. There should be research centers, not just only a museum where you can just visit a few galleries. There should be research centers where you can do deep research, because this will affect a few generations. This is not just something which ends with one generation's tragedy. You have to have research centers, you have to write. And as I said, there are people who are doing it. These kind of books, I hope, will give courage and confidence to many others who are hesitant or who do not know whether this is something that will resonate or there's space for that, is what I'm hoping.
Absolutely, there is space, and I think it will resonate. And this is Kafila, Jhangi family's partition memoir. I think everyone should go out and read this book, because there are wonderful stories in here. Like you mentioned as well, there's so much more. And you weaved in so many other aspects as well about politics and about how the families have just shown tremendous resilience and what they've been through over these years, and how you can still rise, like the phoenix. Even if you're down and out, there is always scope for everyone, each and everyone, to actually rise and go places if you really put your heart and soul to it.
Right.
Anything else that you would like to finally leave us with?
Well, no, I mean, I think the only one concern that I have is that people sometimes try to read or try to find something in a book like this where they believe that it should actually set a narrative what they believe it should set, because people have very set notions. So, for example, there are people who will read it in Pakistan may find, oh, this is a Hindu speaking or an Indian speaking. Hindus may feel that I am a little softer. I've been a little soft on Muslims. I've identified it. I have to sort of say that Muslims gave us shelter and we don't carry any bitterness. And I think, and I hope that doesn't happen, because I've heard this from a couple of people. And I know that I've written it with the deepest honesty. History part I have written as you would write based on your research, not as a historian, as an opinion maker. Memoir I've written the way it is, complete honesty, the way it is, not distortion, no exaggeration. I mean, of course, it's a memoir, so I'll fictionalize a little bit. I mean, if I'm describing how the Karma is going, I was not there, I don't have pictures. I have pictures of archives, but I have to imagine, how the fields look like. To say that there were dogs walking past alongside. I mean, those are my imagination. Because when a village leaves, obviously the dogs will leave with them, right?
Yes.
So you fictionalize that a little bit. Otherwise, all pure facts. And therefore, I do believe that it should be seen as a book that the new generation will feel shows you the real character and strength of this subcontinent.
Absolutely.
We are one people at the end of the day. And if we tell them that, it will help them to bring all of us together down the years, down a few decades.
Absolutely. We are one people at the end of the day. There's no two ways about it. And I think that's the strong message that needs to go out.
That's right.
And Sumant Batra, thank you so much for sharing, the thoughts that you've put into the book, sharing those wonderful partition stories with us. Heart goes out, of course, to your family and to everything that they have been through. Thank you for giving us a part of yourself through the book. And please go out and read the book as well. Kafila is the book. It's a wonderful book. And I think, you'll get so many stories in here. Go ahead, pick up a copy and get to know about the history of India. Get to know about what exactly transpired during, the terrible period, of course, that we had during partition, and get to understand and feel what people must have gone through back then. That's it in this telecast of Frank Talk. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon and share the content as well, so that more people get to know about Bharata First, and also this kind of content will continue to come your way. Until next time, this is Frank Rausan Pereira signing off.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.